Well, hey everyone, Merry Christmas. It's good to see you here. My name is Matt. I'm not the Matt that we voted as the lead pastor last week. Probably should have planned that a little better, but yeah, that's not me. But it is good to be here with you. When I was in college, like most college students, I didn't have a lot of money, and while I thankfully wasn't like only ever eats ramen noodles broke like some college students are, I still had to make some hard decisions every once in a while in order to stick to my budget. And that stress always seemed to be at its absolute highest when it came time to buy textbooks for the upcoming semester. And I remember one particular semester, I had basically just completely emptied my bank account buying the next volley of books. And I was kind of throwing myself a little pity party in my dorm room with the lights off, just being grumpy. And there was a knock on my door, and it was one of my friends from down the hallway, and he came over and kind of half invited, half informed me that basically everyone in the dorm was crashing Applebee's for half-price appetizers that night. And I told him grumpily that I wasn't going to be able to go because I was out of money because stupid textbooks, this place is dumb and I hate it. And he clearly wasn't expecting that much angst out of me all at once because he had to pause and collect himself and said, okay, one, meet me in the library tomorrow at 3 o'clock, and two, grab your keys. If you drive, I'll spot you. And now I'm not one to turn down free mozzarella sticks no matter how grumpy I'm feeling, so I, of course, said yes, grabbed my keys. We went, we had a great time. As one does with half-price appetizers, we felt terrible afterwards. It was a wonderful experience all the way around. And then before I went to bed, I made sure to set a reminder in my phone about my spooky meeting in the library the next day. So after classes that next day, I headed out of class across campus to the campus library, where I met up with my friend who was wearing a library employee name badge. Now, I think I had heard that he worked at the library before this, but I definitely hadn't connected the dots up until this point. And so as I followed him through the library and past the many, many stacks of books, I kind of started to roll my eyes a little bit because I was pretty confident I knew what he was going to show me. See, our campus library had a section where they took all of the course textbooks for the upcoming semester, and they put them in that section so that they were available to students. The problem is, you think about this for more than about 10 seconds, and you realize there's 3 copies of the book and 300 students who all need to write the book report on it at the same time. This was never going to work, and the library did what they could. You couldn't keep those books for more than a day. They had higher fines. They did the best they could, but at the end of the day, those really weren't going to be helpful to you unless you were staked out, ready to grab one at the right time. So I was kind of preparing my thanks but no thanks speech when he walked me right past that stack of books and all the way to the back of the library into one of the back offices where there was this big pile of cardboard shipping boxes. And he asked me, hey, can you help me unpack these and move the books up to the front desk? And since I owed him from the previous night's Applebee's trip, I figured a little bit of manual labor was probably fair game. And so I helped him unpack them, carried all the books upstairs to the front desk. And then afterwards, I was kind of talking to him. I was like, is this what you wanted me here for? And he kind of smiled, and he slid a couple of those books across the desk to me and said, what do you see here? And I looked at the books, and I noticed really quickly that they weren't from our campus library. There were books from Duke University's library, and Biola, and the Dallas Theological Seminary, and there were even a couple that were from across the ocean in England. And it was at this point that my librarian friend let me in on one of the best-kept secrets on my college campus, which was that our library had an agreement with a ton of other university libraries where we could check out books from those libraries and have them shipped to us completely for free with no strings attached, as long as we knew the right person to ask. And I felt like I just got inducted into a secret society here. I found out that I could get all of my school textbooks for free for as long as I needed them, because you could renew these books from the other libraries as many times as you needed, as long as I knew the right question to ask. And before long, I had textbooks showing up for me from across the country, just waiting for me right at the front desk of my little campus library. And from that moment on, I became a full-on power user library nerd of our school's library. In fact, I wound up working at the library for the last 2 years I was there, all because in a moment where I had a need, I had a friend on the inside who understood how to help me. Now, that's kind of the dream for all of us, isn't it? We all want to have an inside man who can help us get a deal or show us a loophole or maybe even get us out of a parking ticket every now and then, right? Everyone wants friends and family pricing, and we will stretch the limit of both friend and family in order to try to get it. But I think this might even run deeper than that, right? As much as saving a few dollars or cutting the occasional line is great, I think this feeling gets at an even more fundamental relational need inside of all of us, which is that deep down, we really just want the other person on the other side of the conversation to get us. We want someone who will take the time to understand our problem, someone who's been through the things that we've been through. That's why it's so frustrating when you pick up the phone and you're met with that little robotic voice reading you menu options, right? Because you know that answering machine doesn't understand you. It can't understand you. And no matter how good the AI on the other side of it gets, it's never going to feel what you're feeling. And that makes a difference. Because when we know that the other person understands us, it becomes a lot easier to trust them to do the right thing. So when we find ourselves in the difficult or frustrating situations of life, we really just want to know that we've got a friend on the other side of us. We want someone who's been where we've been, who's gone through what we've gone through, who values the things that we value, who understands the pains that we've experienced. We want someone like us. We want someone like us fixing our car or selling us a car to make sure that we get the best price. We want someone like us at the DMV or at the bank who can show us that little loophole to get the best possible option. We want someone like us in the corner office or in the Oval Office because, frankly, everything is just a lot easier when there's someone who understands us, when there's someone who gets us. And everything also seems just that much harder when the other person doesn't. And while that's certainly true at the mechanic, it's true at the DMV, I think we all feel this the most when it's the relationships that we care about. Because it's one thing when the Comcast rep doesn't quite understand you. It's another thing when it's your family who doesn't quite understand you. And it's one thing when the contractor just doesn't quite understand what your goals are in this project. It's another thing when it's your spouse who just doesn't quite understand what your priorities are. And not to continue to rain on this parade, but there's a lot of you who are feeling this in an extra special way right now because we're 8 days away from Christmas. And quite frankly, no matter how many times you hear the song, I'll Be Home for Christmas, you can't shake the fact that home is the last place you want to be right now. Because for you, home just means a lot of people who don't understand you, who don't agree with you, don't support you. Or maybe you were hoping that this would be the first Christmas where your house is filled with the pitter-patter of little feet on Christmas morning. But then the adoption fell through, or you had another miscarriage. And once again, that's not your reality this year. Or maybe you were hoping that you would just be able to fill the space underneath the tree with presents for your little ones, but then you got laid off. And now you've got to figure out a way to tell your 4-year-old that Santa's not going to be coming this year. Or maybe this is the first year for you without that one person who really did understand you. And you're trying your best to put on a brave face for the rest of the family, but deep down inside you just feel lonely and empty and forgotten. And through all of this pain, you feel like there's no one who really, truly understands you. No one who feels what you're feeling, who's been through what you've been through. You feel alone and forgotten by the people around you, and maybe even more importantly than that, forgotten by God. Well, Merry Christmas, everyone. No, I'm serious. Merry Christmas. Because I believe that there's an incredible amount of hope in those two words, hope specifically for people who feel like no one understands, and no one sees, and no one hears, because I don't think that's true. I don't think you are alone. I think there is someone who understands you, and I think there is someone who gets you. And the reason I think that is because of the Christmas story. Because yes, The Christmas story is about a baby in a manger. And yes, as Christians, we recognize that that baby grew up to be the man who died on the cross for our sins. And that certainly is enough to warrant our attention this holiday season. But the beauty of the Christmas story isn't just a future promise of us with God. The beauty of the Christmas story is God with us. Right now, right here, in all of our mess. I want to show you this in the Bible, and there are dozens of places that we could look in the Bible to see this principle played out, but I want to specifically look at Hebrews chapter 4 today. And Hebrews chapter 4 is not your typical Christmas passage, but I think it so clearly shows God's heart for us in moments like this that I want to take us there. If you want to follow along in your own Bible, the easiest way to get to Hebrews is to actually open it in the back and just kind of flip a couple pages in, and you'll be in Hebrews before too long. Hebrews is an incredibly beautiful book of the Bible, but it's also a very dense chunk of Bible. The author of the book isn't named, and Hebrews sometimes reads more like it's actually like a transcription of a sermon than a letter like we find in most of the other New Testament books. And because of that, sometimes it can just take a really good pair of reading glasses to follow along with it. I don't know if there's a book in the Bible that makes me have to stop and read things multiple times quite as often as Hebrews does, but it is so worth it. Because the themes and the images in the book of Hebrews are just so foundational and they're so practical. I love Hebrews. And I think if you were to somehow tell me I could only study one book of the Bible for the rest of my life, Hebrews would be right up there at the top of the list. And today we're going to pick up in Hebrews 4, which is right in the middle of a topic in the book of Hebrews. And you can tell that's the case because the first word of our passage today is the word therefore. And that just simply tells us that what we're going to look at today is the result of something that got explained earlier. And so first, I want to just do some quick summarizing to get you up to speed. The main theme of the book of Hebrews is really simple. It's basically this idea that Jesus is better than a whole bunch of things, and so we as his followers must not allow our attention to drift off of him. Jesus is better, and so we must not drift. In the book of Hebrews, the author's arguing that Jesus is better than a whole bunch of stuff. He's better than the prophets. He's better than the patriarchs. He's better than Moses and the other Old Testament leaders. He's a better sacrifice. He's a better covenant with better promises. He's better than the angels. He's better than everyone and everything. There's no comparison. And because Jesus is better than what anyone or anything else has to offer us, it becomes important that we don't allow our focus to drift off of him, because the further we get away from Jesus, we're just missing out on the better thing. That's Hebrews in a nutshell. And in this specific section, we've just spent a chunk of time unpacking that Jesus is better than the Old Testament priests. And there, we could talk for hours about the parallels between the Old Testament priesthood and Jesus, and we can have a real nerdy Bible discussion about it. But for today, let's just suffice it to say that the Old Testament priesthood for the nation of Israel represented two things. It represented cleansing from sin, and it represented access to God. Cleansing from sin and access to God. The priests represented cleansing from sin because they were the method that the law of Moses laid out for having sins forgiven. So if you broke the law, depending on exactly what part of the law you would break, you would bring an animal, sometimes a dove or a sheep or an ox, and you would bring it to the temple where it would be sacrificed on the altar in the temple courtyard. And the priests would take the blood of that animal and they would sprinkle it on the altar or sometimes other parts of the temple, depending on the specifics of the sacrifice that was being given. And that blood of that animal atoned for, which literally means covered up, your sins. So if you broke the law, which would have happened a lot because none of us is perfect, the only way for you to restore that relationship with God was through the blood of an animal at the hands of the priests. And so day after day, the priests are offering sacrifice after sacrifice in this never-ending stream of blood as a constant reminder of the sinfulness of the people and their need to have the sins atoned for. So they represented cleansing from sin, and the priests also represented access to God because they were the only people who were allowed to enter the temple building. You couldn't enter, I couldn't enter, the king couldn't enter. It was just the priests. And it's even a little more complicated than that because the temple here is divided with a huge curtain. And the back room of the temple is called the Holy of Holies, and that is where the presence of God resided in the nation of Israel. And there was only one person who was allowed to enter that room, the high priest. And even he couldn't enter whenever he wanted. He got one day a year, the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, where he was allowed to enter behind the curtain, where he offered the Day of Atonement sacrifice and then immediately left. So if you wanted to go see God as a layperson, it just straight up wasn't going to happen because you couldn't even get in the building, let alone the room where the presence of God lived. So everything about your relationship with God was mediated through the priests. And all of this is the backdrop of verse 14, where the author of Hebrews explains that Jesus is better than the Old Testament priests. He says this, verse 14, "Therefore, since we have a great high priest who is ascended into heaven, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess." I want to zoom in specifically on this phrase here, who has ascended into heaven. Remember, the point of this book is that Jesus is better. So how is this better than the Old Testament priests? Well, remember, two things the priesthood represented: cleansing from sin and access to God. The idea of a priest ascending into heaven would have been a clear statement of superiority over the old system. This gets explained actually really clearly a few chapters later in Hebrews 9. Hebrews 9:24. "For Christ did not enter a sanctuary made with human hands that was only a copy of the true one. He entered heaven itself, now to appear for us in God's presence." So Jesus, unlike the Old Testament priests, doesn't enter into a temple that's just a copy of a greater thing. Jesus enters into heaven itself. It's a better kind of access to God. He's not walking into a temple that's symbolic. He's walking into heaven itself. In verse 25, "Nor did he enter heaven to offer himself again and again, the way the high priest enters the most holy place every year with blood that's not his own. Otherwise, Christ would have had to suffer many times since the creation of the world. But he has appeared once for all at the culmination of the ages to do away with sin by the sacrifice of himself." So again, contrast this to the Old Testament priests, which have to offer sacrifices again and again and again, day after day. Jesus offers one sacrifice that does away with sin once and for all. So Jesus offers better cleansing from sin, and he offers better access to God. So what this verse is saying when it says that he ascended into heaven is a clear statement that Jesus is better than the Old Testament priest. He's not any old high priest. He's better because he offers better cleansing of sin, and he offers better access to God. He's better than the priests. Now, at this point, it's worth pausing for a second, because this is all pretty academic, admittedly, and hopefully you're able to track with me. But for a second, I want to take the academic hat off and put the real life hat back on. This is good. I can understand why this is better than the old system, but frankly, it doesn't solve the problem that I'm feeling right now. A priest who ascended into heaven is great, but I'm still carrying all of the same things that I was carrying when I came in here, and I was kind of expecting God to be the solution to all of these problems. But frankly, this angle of Jesus, this looks even more distant than when I came in here. He ascended into heaven. I can't do that. How is that guy supposed to understand me? How am I supposed to relate to him at all? How is he supposed to feel what I feel? How is he supposed to know what I'm going through? If you're in the original Hebrew audience for this passage, you're actually feeling this maybe even on another level, because by the time this passage is written, the priests had sort of moved from like just a religious part of society to become almost like an elite ruling class in society. So for them, they already couldn't relate to the high priest, and now you're telling me that the high priest has just gone and beamed himself up into heaven? I want us to feel this tension right now. The only method of access I have to God is through a human priesthood, which, by the way, is restricted to just one of Israel's 12 tribes. So I couldn't just sign up to be a priest if I wanted to. And I only get to participate in that process by bringing a sacrifice to cover my sins. So I'm multiple layers removed from God already, and now the high priest has gone and ascended into heaven. I think I think the writer wants us to feel that tension. I think this is supposed to feel a little bit unattainable right here in this moment, because look at where the author goes next, verse 15. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin. This great high priest is able to empathize with us. He's able to put himself in our shoes. Despite having ascended into heaven, despite being seated at the right hand of God, he is able to empathize with our weaknesses. This is one of the unique realities of the Christian faith that sets it apart from a lot of other religions. In most religions, God is out there, up there, completely set apart from us, and there's no relationship there. God certainly doesn't understand us. He might pity us or something like that, but there's no empathy. There's no common ground between me and God. That's not the case here with Jesus. Jesus is able to understand us. How is that? Well, this passage says it's because he's been tempted in every way, but even that hints at a little bit bigger picture, because there are other places in the Bible that we hear that God cannot be tempted. So how does Jesus, who is God himself, our great high priest, become tempted in every way? This is where this passage becomes a Christmas message, because the answer to that question is Christmas. The great high priest becomes tempted by stepping out of heaven and in humility taking on flesh and becoming a human like us. And for 33 years, Jesus walks the planet facing all of the hardships and troubles and trials that come with it. Have you ever thought about why Jesus had to become a baby? Like, why did he have to grow up? I guess you can make the argument that if Jesus is going to die on a cross, he has to become a man first. But we're already talking about miraculous events happening. Why not just come down as a man and take the fast track to the cross? Why do we have to start with a baby? This is why. Because when God came to earth at Christmas, God wasn't just thinking of a way to get us to God. He was thinking of a way to bring God to us. Right here, right now. So when we think about the baby in the manger this Christmas season, wrapped up in that little nativity scene is the reality that that baby is going to become a little boy. And is going to become a preteen, and a teenager, and a young adult, and a 30-year-old. And what this passage is saying is that the end product of that time here on earth is that Jesus, God himself, is able to empathize with me. Because now, on the other side of the manger, the great high priest seated in heaven has spent 33 years walking a broken, sin-cursed earth and dealing with broken, sinful people, experiencing life just as we do, the pain, the trial, the loss, with one significant difference, however. He does all of this without sinning, which at first glance kind of sounds like the easy way out. Because if I'm honest with myself, a lot of the hardship that I face in life is ultimately the result of sinful choices that I've made. So if Jesus never sinned and never gave in to temptation, that feels like a pretty big flaw in this whole empathy argument that we're setting out today. But let's think about this for a second. A little thought experiment. Let's say that the Department of Transportation finally decides to replace the I-5 bridge. They've been talking about it for 20 years. They finally are going to get around to it and replace it. And they're going to replace it just like currently with 2 bridges, one in each direction. And they design these bridges so that they can hold the weight of, let's say, 1,000 cars. I clearly have no idea how you do bridges, but we're just going to say that you measure them in cars. That's how you do it. So they build these bridges. And before they open the bridges, naturally they want to test them. And they want to make sure that the bridges will live up to the standard that's been set out. And so they start with the bridge on the left, and they start rolling cars onto the bridge. They get a couple hundred cars on there, and they notice that the bridge isn't doing as well as they'd hoped. There's some cracks and a couple places where it's sagging a little bit. And as they roll more and more cars on, Chunks of concrete start to fall off, and the road starts to twist. And then finally, as they push the 500th car onto the bridge, it ultimately gives out and collapses. And everyone's pretty bummed out about that, because in addition to now having the collapsed bridge, we've got 500 cars in the river, because that's how we test bridges in this universe, apparently. But maybe even more than that, everyone's really concerned about the other bridge now. So they start to test it. But this bridge is different, because they roll 300, 400, 500 cars onto it, and it's fine. Not even so much as a crack. So they keep going. 600, 700, 800 cars. Totally fine. And then as they roll the 1,000th car onto the bridge is great. It's passed the test. Now, let's imagine in this universe where we test bridges by pushing cars onto them, that the bridges can also talk to each other, okay? So after hours, after the day, the bridge that's collapsed on the ground looks up at the other bridge and says, "Man, you have no idea what I've been through today." What would the other bridge say? The other bridge would be right to say, I kind of do know what you've been through. I passed the test. In fact, there was a whole portion of the test that you never even saw, but I did feel what you felt. That's what's going on here. You and me, we didn't live up to the standard. We were tempted and we fail. But Jesus passed the test. So even though he didn't sin, we still can have confidence that a sinless Jesus is able to empathize with us in our weakness, because he was tested the same way that we are. And sure, there's a good chance that Jesus probably didn't experience your exact temptation, right? I doubt Jesus was ever tempted to speed down I-5. That probably wasn't a thing that he would have even conceptualized. But we don't have to look very far into the Gospels to find stories of Jesus going through the same things that we do. He experienced the death of loved ones, the rejection of friends, loss, physical pain, the rejection of his Father. When Jesus came to earth and took on flesh, he willingly placed himself through the full gauntlet of the human experience, so that on the other side of it, he could be just as we are. So if you're here today and you're hurting, and you're carrying a heavy burden this holiday season, and you feel like there's just no one who truly understands you, I want you to hear today that Jesus gets you. Jesus gets you. He understands. He gets the loneliness that you feel when the holiday season rolls around and your house is quiet and empty. He understands the brokenheartedness that comes when you unpack the Christmas decorations and you get to that one stocking and you have to sadly just put it back in the box because you know that they won't be here this year. He understands the stress of everyone in the house expecting all of your attention all at once. And he gets the moments when you just need a few moments of peace to yourself. Even if no one else in this life understands you, I believe that Jesus gets you. So what does this do for us? What does understanding this change in our lives? Well, first, this verse 15, it says we have a great high priest who gets us. The verse starts with the word "for," which means that all of this is the why to something that got explained earlier. We do something because we have an empathetic high priest. What is that thing? It's this "let us" statement here in verse 14. Kind of a free Bible study tip. Anytime you're in the book of Hebrews and you see the word "let us," that's a moment that we can apply something. Let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. So what does understanding that we have a high priest who understands us do for us? It strengthens our faith in hard times. Because it is so much easier to trust when the person on the other side understands us. So if we can get this truth right and cement this picture of Jesus into our minds, the implication of this passage is that we will, as a result of that relationship, have a stronger and more stable faith. The kind of faith that isn't shaken by cancer or the death of a loved one. The kind of faith that can survive financial hardship or an unexpected layoff. the kind of faith that overcomes addiction, the kind of faith that holds out hope against hope that God can restore your marriage or can bring your child back to you, the kind of faith that obeys God even when we know it will cost us. That kind of faith, that strong, immovable faith, comes from knowing a high priest who can empathize with us. There's a second thing that this understanding does for us, which is actually my favorite part of this whole message. You ready for it? There's another let us in verse 16. Let us then, because of that high priest, approach God's throne of grace with confidence. Do you see that? Because of Jesus, because he became a man, because our great high priest offered a better sacrifice, now we have access. Because of Jesus, because God took on flesh, because the Creator became the creation, because Jesus walked this planet for 33 years, because he made the perfect sacrifice on a cross in our place, because he rose on the third day and is seated at the right hand of God, now, instead of needing to go through a priest to access God, we walk confidently into God's throne room ourselves. And in a beautiful reversal of what you would expect, we find a throne not of judgment, but a throne of grace. Folks, thrones aren't places of grace. They are symbols of power, and they are symbols of fear. But this throne is different. There is no judgment because the judgment has already been given. The price has already been paid, and so what's left is a throne of grace. And we, through no merit of our own, but through the sacrifice of our great high priest, whose blood covers all of our sins once and for all, we approach that throne so that we may receive mercy, which is forgiveness for all of our past failures, and find grace to help us in our time of need. Because of the great high priest who is able to empathize with us, we have confident access to God. Because God walked humbly down to earth, we walk confidently into the throne room before the throne of grace to find grace and mercy. I want to leave us with a couple of questions that are just really designed to help us evaluate if our faith matches the version of faith that this passage shows us. And these would be great questions to ponder yourself, or maybe even ask a mentor or someone in your community group to help you think through, because they're the kind of questions that are going to require you to be pretty brutally honest with yourself. Because these are the questions that when you first see them, your temptation is going to be to say, well, yeah, I do great at that. But if we really think about it, that may actually not be the case. So the first one is this: how firm is your faith? Do you feel like your confidence in God changes as the circumstances of your life change? Would a diagnosis of cancer or a financial hardship, would that change your view of God? Would a significant health scare or problem or significant trial in life push you towards God, or would it push you away from him? How firm is your faith, actually? Second is this: how quick are you to turn to prayer? As followers of Jesus, we have access to the throne of grace. So the question is, do you access the throne of grace? When things go wrong in life, is prayer your first option, or is it the option you go to after you've exhausted all of your own ideas and solutions? Third, do you approach the throne with confidence? I remember coming across a tweet from Tim Keller about 8 years ago, and it's just kind of stuck itself in my soul. The only person who dares wake up a king at 3 a.m. for a glass of water is a child. We have that kind of access. This reminds me of the confidence with which my 2-year-old asks me for things. often with no regard for whether I'm busy or on the phone or even sleeping, with no regard for whether the thing she's asking me for is realistic or even humanly possible. She will barge through that door and ask because she knows that she needs something, and she knows that Daddy loves her and wants to provide it. And that's me. I'm not a perfect father. I disappoint that kid all of the time, and yet over and over and over, she, with all the confidence a 2-year-old can muster, asks. Does our approach to the throne look like that? So those questions again: how firm is your faith? How quickly do you turn to prayer? And how confident do you approach the throne with confidence? And if you don't like your answer to any of those 3 questions, it may actually be time to reevaluate your relationship with that high priest. To take some time this holiday season and spend some time hearing from him through his word, speaking to him through prayer. Reevaluate that relationship. So this Christmas season, let's be people who approach the throne of grace with confidence. Let's be people who lean on a great high priest who gets us, who understands the pain and the hurt that we're feeling. And when the trials of life come and we find ourselves in a moment where we question if anyone really truly gets us, let's remember that because of the baby in the manger that we celebrate this Christmas season, we have access to God with us. Let's pray. Jesus, our great high priest, we enter your throne room today with confidence, not because we have earned it, certainly not because we deserve it, but because you have earned it for us. And so we rest on your perfect, once-for-all sacrifice that covers all of our sins. And we ask for grace and mercy from the high priest who gets us. So God, we ask that this holiday season that we would not allow our eyes to drift off of you, that we would stay focused on you, and that you would fill us with an understanding of your love for us and an understanding that you do understand us. You get us. And so God, strengthen our faith in the hard times. We love you and we are grateful for the sacrifice and your love for us that makes all of this possible. In Jesus' name.